Moonlit water, a speedboat erupts. F-35s bed down in Puerto Rico, while Venezuelan F-16s skim a U.S. destroyer. We've heard this rhythm before. Panama, 1989. Is this deterrence or the first page of something larger? I'll show you the signs. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The sea looked like black glass the night the wakes began to carve it. White scars drifting south, hull numbers sliding over the horizon, as if written by an invisible hand. The radios hissed the exact words they always do before anything irreversible. Temporary, deterrent, measured, but the Caribbean knows the smell of pressure, the way fishermen know a storm by taste. In the first days of September, when the ocean turned tense and the moon hung like a dull coin, a U.S. missile unstitched a small boat in the southern waters, and the tally came back as it usually does. 11 lives reduced to a line in a briefing. Washington said they were traffickers, men of the Tren de Aragua, a gang newly christened with a name that opened shore legal doors, terrorist. Caracas said the footage was deceitful. People on the islands did what they have always done when something huge passes by their coasts. They lowered their voices and made their children sleep early, understanding the geopolitical dynamics at play. From Puerto Rico's runways came a second sound, the careful, predatory purr of stealth fighters bedding down beneath hot canvas. 10 F-35s, silver cats with folded thunder, arrived as a reply to a maneuver that is older than any of us. 2 Venezuelan F-16s skimming the air above a U.S. destroyer to say we are not afraid to be close to you. The ship was the Jason Dunham, an Arleigh Burke, dressed for every kind of weather. The Pentagon called the flyover a show of force. The newspapers called it an escalation. The sea just absorbed the heat. And beneath all that choreography, 8 U.S. warships, a prowling attack submarine, and enough surveillance planes to comb every wrinkle of horizon began to write a paragraph across the map that every Latin American recognizes by rhythm, if not by ink. On the amphibious decks, the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit drilled on cue with sailors from the Jima Amphibious Ready Group. 3 ships, Jima, San Antonio, Fort Lauderdale, more than 4,500 souls folded into steel. The literal combat ship Minneapolis, St. Paul, prowled the shallows where law blurs with proximity. A cruiser with an old memory of ballistic arcs took up its watch. In official sentences, these are capabilities and postures. In the quiet math of a region that has been taught too often by shock, they are omens. How do storms begin here? Not with thunder, with paper. A still-secret directive signed in July, ordering the Pentagon to treat certain Latin American cartels like the kind of enemy the military was built to fight. Another declaration, heavier than it sounds, that a Venezuelan criminal network is not only a network, but a terrorist arm, and that Nicolas Maduro stands atop it as its head. The phrases do more than accuse. They rearrange the tools that are considered appropriate. They say the Coast Guard's ladder is no longer the instrument. They say the missile is now a form of speech. So the first strike came as a sentence fired from far away. The promise followed. More such sentences, and soon. Caracas answered in the language of sovereignty. Maduro called the deployment the most significant threat the continent had seen in a century and counted missiles as if counting teeth in a mouth leaning toward him. He promised maximum rebellion if foreign steel touched Venezuelan soil. He called the flyover a warning. Washington called it provocation. The radio voices on both shores know their scripts and their audiences by heart. But people do not live on podiums. They live under roofs that remember other nights. And those roofs creaked with an old kind of memory. We have stood in this wind before. It is tempting to say this is unprecedented because the names on the ships are new and the jets wear a different skin, but our memory is longer than the paint. 36 years ago, in a December that still smells of smoke, the United States landed in Panama to take a man whose face was already printed on the walls of 1,000 neighborhoods. He was indicted in Florida. He ruled by brutality and rumor. He misread the weather. The operation wore a name that sounded like a verdict, Just Cause, and it moved with the speed of a door kicked before dawn. The end came with a surrender on January 3rd. The beginning was much older, echoing the long-term implications of U.S. military actions in Latin America. Let's examine the most notable case to gain insights into what Latin America may be. Panama is a narrow waist tied between oceans, 400 miles long and 50 miles wide, small enough to cross, large enough to drown you. From 1914, the canal carved there became a clock that the United States swore to keep wound. Treaties promised the handover by 2000. But before the keys changed hands, a series of crises set a fuse. Manuel Noriega, an intelligence man who traded secrets for greater ones, rose after Torrijos's death in 1983 to hold the Panama Defense Force in his fist. He smiled for Washington when it suited him and for traffickers when it paid enough. He smiled for himself most of all. Elections came. He smeared them. A Florida indictment followed. He learned to gamble with the superpower's patience. That is not a game you win twice. Plans multiplied with names that sounded like parables whispered in a bunker. Elaborate maze to keep the canal open and Americans safe while answers were still supposedly political. Prayer book and its liturgy of contingencies. Klondike Key, post time, blue spoon, blind logic. Early drafts relied on intimidation, build up so visibly that even a stubborn man steps aside. But the U.S. government at the time was a choir that couldn't agree on a hymn. The State Department cleared its throat one way, Defense another, the intelligence services in a third key. Congress half in tune and half working an entirely different song. Noriega, listening, learned the wrong lesson, that the great power would scowl forever and leave before it bled. When Major Moises Giroldi moved against Noriega in October of '89, he asked for help to seal the arteries of the capital. Washington hesitated, worrying, as it often must, about trust, timing, and the cost of being seen. The coup collapsed. Giroldi was executed. In that failure lay the seed of what came next. Acceleration. Joint Task Force South stood up. Reinforcements flowed. Blue Spoon, the plan to move troops already in country and fly in thousands more, was tightened from 2 nervous weeks to the tempo of a fist. Surprise eroded. You cannot move 200 airplanes without ripples, but simultaneity was the point. If you strike everywhere at once, the door cannot be braced. On December 19th, the airlift began. C-130s shouldering low over the Atlantic, C-141s stacked like punctuation, 11 C-5s hauling the awkward cargo of a short, decisive war. Fighters, F-15s and F-16s, rode shotgun to tell Cuba and Nicaragua, do not think you can improvise in this score. At Sidero 4-5 on the 20th, 15 minutes ahead of schedule because the defenders moved before their cue, the first blows landed. Special operators struck key nodes. At Rio Hato, Rangers came out of the night into concentrated fire and kept moving until 250 PDF troops surrendered. At Punta Paitila, SEALs bled at the water's edge and kept their foothold. Over barracks, F-117s laid down precision bombs meant to stun entire units before the parachutes appeared against the dark. Conventional task forces rolled arcs across the city, Atlantic to the ports, Semper Fi to Howard Air Force Base and the Bridge of the Americas, bayonet clawing at the Comandancia, where the hard men had built their nest. Numbers followed as they always do in the wake of hard events. By the end of D-Day, 1,236 prisoners in U.S. hands, 53 PDF soldiers dead. Numbers explain, and they hide. In the neighborhoods where gunfire braided itself into the shouts of mothers, the grief took a different measure. U.S. losses stood at 23 dead. The Panamanian toll was counted and recounted, 297, 500. More, the arithmetic of civilians always floating because it is done with shaking hands. The justifications arrived in polished language. Protect Americans, restore a stolen election, keep the canal running by the treaty's letter, and act in self-defense under law. All proper in their lanes, all partial in the way truth becomes when it is asked to carry a rifle. And yet the operation moved fast enough to matter. Noriega, who had won every previous round by confusing the room, discovered that decisive action has its own music. He slipped into the papal nunciature on Christmas Eve and turned diplomacy into a lock with too many keys. Washington cordoned the building. The Vatican negotiated the line between refuge and obstruction. 12 days later, on January 3rd, the man stepped out and surrendered to a country that had decided it would no longer be embarrassed by its own threats. Why reopen that room now when the current sea glitters with new steel and new names? Because the rhyme is insistent. In the Caribbean today, the grammar begins again with designations. Cartel becomes terrorist. Policing becomes war by other paperwork. A missile at night writes a terse message over black water. A pair of fighter jets draws a line in the air, and the other side answers by positioning stealth within reach. A flotilla too small to invade is sized just right to sting. Raids from decks, capture or kill missions in the gaps between laws, the relentless metronome of targeted operations. All of this is explained as counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism, and much of it is precisely that. But Latin America has learned that stated purposes tend to travel with unstated ones in the same convoy. Hidden aims are not exactly hidden, they're just unannounced. In '89, the list lengthened as the days passed. Secure the canal, yes. Remove a man, yes. Dismantle his apparatus, unexpectedly, yes. Seat a government and demonstrate resolve to audiences far from Panama City, emphatically, yes. In the present tense, you can hear the possibilities circulating even while denials are polished. Maintain pressure that degrades a regime's confidence. Peel at loyalties in barracks. Create conditions where a national solution, some colonel reading the weather, becomes thinkable. If that fails, keep the scalpel sharp for the next dark target skimming the waves. Each strike another syllable in a language of force. It may never become a paragraph called invasion. It may stay a chain of short, complex sentences that leave the same bruises. These rhythms are why an island grandmother lowers her voice when the jets pass overhead, not because she is sure the last step will come, but because she knows that miscalculation is the most common cause of our tragedies. In Panama, the triggers arrived all at once. A state of war declared by a trembling assembly, a Marine killed at a checkpoint. In the Caribbean, the air is already full of gestures that can turn into triggers. One pilot misjudges a pass over a destroyer's deck. One radar operator misreads intent. One night, too many ships crowd a channel. The difference between deterrent and incident is often the width of a breath. Sovereignty is the word we keep bending until it hurts. In our hemisphere, it means a nation's right to make its own mistakes, even the flamboyant ones, so long as they do not spill over another's border or harbor armies meant to break someone else's. It means the right to be insufferable without inviting tanks, the right to exhaust a people's patience at the ballot box rather than on a runway under flares. It also means that a flag cannot be a cloak protecting crimes forever, that men who poison neighborhoods, north and south, are not absolved because they kneel in a capitol. Between those truths runs the narrow channel we have to navigate while the wind rises. In '89, Washington told itself a story about credibility. A new president could not be seen to flinch. After months of mixed signals, bureaus stepping on each other's sentences, Congress talking over the cabinet, force became the clean verb that renders ambiguity obsolete. It worked, at a price. 23 U.S. soldiers dead, hundreds of Panamanians killed, thousands displaced, 77,000 weapons stacked in warehouses as if order were something you could weigh. And then the quiet work of mending a city punctured by precision, the civil affairs officers and reservists building bridges of routine over the cratered days. Food by the ton. Camps were erected in the flat light of uneasy mornings. Departure timelines. Speeches that sounded like self-blessing. We remember because the memory is a warning flares that shoot up to mark shoals. In the present crisis, the White House speaks of narco-terror and every element of power. Critics argue over law and proportionality. Supporters discuss the highest and best use of a military that trains its pilots to fight enemies who do not wear uniforms. The partisan blades flash, the ships continue their patterns. For families in Maracaibo and Mayagüez, in Willemstad and Barranquilla, the argument is less a question of doctrine than of weather. Is this the breeze that shakes the laundry lines, or the current that drags the whole village seaward? Let us be honest, since memory is useless otherwise. The United States cultivated Noriega until the costs outgrew the benefits, then learned, again, that pragmatism without principle leads to nights you cannot justify even to yourself. The habit recurred in other theaters. Saddam courted against Iran until he misread the room and made war into a habit. Balkan butcheries discounted until the televised siege made cowardice impossible. Somalia's clan war misread until bodies were dragged through dust under a sky suddenly full of cameras. The pattern is not that the United States loves war. It is that confusion and delay teach the worst men that they can move without consequence, and then consequences arrive in thunder. From this, several cautions for any great power stepping close to our shores. Do not make threats you will not carry to their end. Avoid labeling an enemy terrorist simply because it is convenient. Other words would suffice. This practice will narrow your options later and expand the scope of your imagined authority, Do not point a destroyer at a coastline and call it messaging unless you are prepared to translate your message into something irreversible. Do not confuse the drug trade, a network that dissolves, reforms, reroutes, with a nation, which breaks and then burdens its children with the gluing. And if what you seek is a demonstration for audiences far away, proof of resolve, proof of spine, then admit the cost you are asking Latin America to pay for your lesson. But to my own continent, I must say the other half of the sentence. Sovereignty is not a magic word. If your rulers live as if your flag were armor for their appetites, you will end up with ships at your door. If your generals treat the barracks like a family business, the ledger will someday include them by name. If your traffickers make every river mouth a smuggling lane, the sea will one day bristle with strangers who say they are here because your problems became theirs. The only way to keep your waters your own is to make your house inhospitable to the pests others carry. This is not capitulation. It is memory turned into policy. Tonight, the Caribbean is perfect. That is the most dangerous sentence I know. Perfect water, the long humming patience of destroyers at low power, an amphibious deck lit like a small city, full of men and women who joined to serve and now live inside a paragraph larger than any one life. A cruiser that has practiced swatting ballistic arcs in other oceans and listens here for the rumor of hostile air. A literal ship designed for the in-between places, slipping along shelves no one maps for tourists. In San Juan, stealth fighters cradle their wings and heat shimmers above them. Somewhere, in an operations center with too much chilled air and too many screens, someone thumbs a still secret directive and says softly, "Proceed." In Caracas, a president promises rebellion and clutches the word homeland like a talisman. In Washington, another president promises justice and clutches the phrase rule of law like a badge. In between, the islands hold their breath and tell stories to pass the hours before dawn, about a speedboat turned to splinters and accusations turned to doctrine, about fighters skimming a destroyer's skin and warnings to shoot them down next time, about raids that may already be scheduled and names that may soon be crossed off. They tell the older story, too, of a December airlift that lit the night, of rangers on a runway and seals in water that tasted of cordite, of a papal nunciature surrounded by men with radios and a general who counted weapons by the pallet. They say the point of remembering is not to accuse the past forever, but to carry a lamp into the next dark hallway. What happens if this ends well? That is the funny word policymakers use when they mean without a headline that haunts us. Perhaps it becomes a string of interdictions and arrests, videos of fast boats turned to fountains of steel, press conferences about seizures measured in kilos and millions. Perhaps it becomes pressure inside Venezuela's barracks, a quiet recalcitrance among officers who have learned to survive every storm by bending, until one morning they bend toward a new line. Perhaps a colonel nobody knows today steps forward, announces a provisional committee, and begs the hemisphere for patience. Perhaps Washington applauds and says, "This is sovereignty returning from exile." Perhaps. And what if it ends the other way, with a mistake pressed into duty as a trigger? A pilot misjudges airspace. A radar operator in a floating city sees a threat in a blue blur, and an automated system finishes his sentence for him. In the echo that follows, politicians speak in the only tense their jobs afford, the urgent present, and the word response becomes a staircase we climb with our eyes closed. The destroyers do what destroyers were built to do. The stealth jets do what stealth jets are famous for. The amphibious decks become a choreography we've all watched on other screens. Afterward, we will rename phases. Blind logic will become promote liberty or its modern cousin, and we will feed people in camps we did not intend to build. We will count the dead with hands that tremble too much for accuracy. We will say, as we always say, that we never wanted this, which will be true and useless at the same time. If there is a single sentence I want our continent to keep, it is this: clarity saves lives and ambiguity spends them. When the United States told Noriega, through clenched teeth but open hands, that it would not go further, it taught him to believe what he wanted. When it finally did go further, it did so in a way that left marks still visible on the walls of El Chorrillo and in the eyes of people who remember the wrong kind of fireworks. If Washington today intends only to slash at the arteries of a trade that poisons our barrios and theirs, let it say so in a way that binds its own hands against the temptations that always appear when ships are already in theater. If it intends to press until a regime cracks, let it tell the truth about the price and about the ownership that follows. If it wants to demonstrate resolve for audiences far away, let it reckon aloud with the cost it asks the Caribbean to bear for its lesson. And if our answer, as Latin Americans, is the same as it has always been, fear laced with defiance, memory braided with questions, sovereignty held like a fragile cup, then let us conduct ourselves as if we mean it. Clean our own house so the pretexts dry up in the sun. Refuse to allow our tyrants to use the flag as a shield for their appetites. Build the kind of civic muscle that can say to any fleet, we have our problems, we are solving them, and we will not let your solutions replace them with something worse. The night is beautiful. That is how you know it's about to break. The sea is saying the same thing it said when rangers fell through Panamanian dark, and when a small boat in the southern waters burst into a white flower. Remember, it whispers, not because remembering makes you righteous, but because it makes you ready. In the end, a child will ask why the adults are speaking in low voices while the weather is perfect, and her grandmother will tell this story under a blackened sky, of a buildup that pretended to be a pause, of jets that wrote warnings in the air, of ships that could not help but carry their own gravity. She will trace a line back to a December when history came knocking in the night. She will say, keep the door locked and your memory open. She will throw another branch on the fire. The sparks will go up like tracer rounds. The sea will keep speaking. And we, who have learned its language the hard way, will listen, not to surrender to storms repeating themselves, but to steer between them like a people who intend to remain. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.